Have you ever wondered why your life feels unusually solitary? Why every time you try to belong, to merge, to lean on someone for comfort, something collapses instead? At first you call it bad luck, then abandonment. Then you start asking darker questions. What's wrong with me? Why do I always end up alone? Most people assume isolation means failure, that if you're alone long enough, something must be broken. But here's the uncomfortable possibility no one prepares you for. What if the isolation isn't punishment? And it isn't automatically sacred either. What if it's a containment mechanism? Not a warm one, not a comforting one, but a precise one. Some forms of protection don't feel like safety. They feel like restriction, like being held still while everything familiar is stripped away. And that's where people get lost. Because isolation can do two very different things. It can sharpen you, or it can rot you. It can clarify you, or quietly turn into avoidance. And the difference isn't spiritual, it's behavioral. If your solitude is making you more honest, more self-directed, more willing to face what you'd rather escape, something is being prepared. If it's making you bitter, superior, or frozen in place, something is being avoided. This video isn't here to tell you which one you are. That would be irresponsible. It's here to ask a harder question. What is your isolation requiring of you right now? Because real protection doesn't remove you from pressure. It controls how much pressure you can handle, so you're not destroyed before you're ready. And that preparation? It's colder than comfort, more precise than kindness, and it doesn't care how special the story sounds, only whether you're willing to do the work. Welcome to Chosen One, Shadows. This is not a space for comfort narratives. It's not a place to collect labels, identities, or spiritual shortcuts, and it's not here to convince you that your suffering automatically means something special. This channel exists for a different reason. Most spiritual conversations around divine protection are framed in light, white light, safety, reassurance, constant affirmation. Protection is described as ease, as doors opening, as life smoothing itself out once you're aligned. But for a certain type of person, that version never fit. For you, protection didn't look like rescue. It looked like removal. People fell away. Opportunities collapsed. Identities you once relied on stopped working. And instead of clarity, what you felt first was loss. Here's the part most teachers avoid saying out loud. Some forms of protection don't preserve your life as it is. They dismantle it, not to punish you, but not to reward you either. Because there is a difference between being protected from harm and being protected from becoming too comfortable in a version of yourself that cannot carry what comes next. That distinction matters. And it's also where people get stuck. Because isolation, loss, and pressure are not proof of purpose by default. They are conditions. What they produce depends entirely on how you respond to them. This channel will never tell you this is happening because you're chosen. That would be irresponsible. What it will do is show you the psychological and behavioral mechanics behind experiences many people spiritualize too quickly, and ask a harder question in return. Is what you're going through actually making you clearer, steadier, and more self-directed? Or is it quietly giving you a story that allows you to stop engaging with your own growth? Chosen One. Shadows is not about claiming an identity. It's about surviving the preparation without lying to yourself. So as we move forward in this video, don't listen for validation. Listen for friction. If something here unsettles you, don't reject it, and don't adopt it blindly. Pause. Because real preparation doesn't ask for belief. It asks for responsibility. And that's where this conversation actually begins. Most people experience isolation and immediately interpret it as abandonment. They assume something went wrong, that they failed socially, that they weren't likable enough, useful enough, or aligned enough to be kept. And when that explanation doesn't fully satisfy, the story gets darker. God, left me. The universe turned its back on me. I must have done something wrong. But there is another possibility, one that is uncomfortable precisely because it doesn't flatter you. Some forms of isolation are not rejection. They are containment. Not containment in the sense of safety, but containment in the sense of control. In psychology and in medicine, quarantine exists for a reason, not because what's inside is weak, but because mixing it too early or too freely would compromise something critical. Energetic quarantine works the same way. When your internal state is unstable but malleable, when your identity is dissolving but not yet rebuilt, exposure becomes dangerous, not to others, but to you. This is where people misunderstand what's happening. They assume they're being excluded. In reality, they're being restricted. But here's the first responsibility checkpoint. Not all isolation is quarantine. Some isolation is simply avoidance wearing spiritual language. The difference isn't mystical. It's functional. True energetic quarantine doesn't inflate your sense of importance. It reduces your access to distraction. You lose easy validation. You lose familiar feedback loops. You lose the ability to define yourself through constant reflection from others. And that loss creates pressure. Pressure reveals things. When people are removed from noise, one of two things happens. They either become clearer or they become more distorted. Clarity looks like this. You start noticing your own patterns without immediately blaming the world. You become more deliberate with your time, your attention, your boundaries. You begin making decisions without waiting for permission or applause. Distortion looks very different. Resentment builds. Superiority sneaks in. The story becomes, I'm alone because I'm above all this. That's not quarantine. That's compensation. Real quarantine doesn't protect your ego. It exposes it. Think of a surgical environment. A surgeon doesn't isolate before an operation because they're fragile. They isolate because precision matters. Contamination doesn't just come from dirt, it comes from excess contact, unnecessary movement, uncontrolled variables. And if you're in a phase where your internal structure is being rewritten, too much external influence becomes contamination. Not because other people are low vibration, but because you're not stable enough yet to engage without being pulled off course. That's the part people resist, because it means the isolation isn't about being special, it's about being unfinished. Energetic quarantine doesn't say, you're superior. It says, you're not ready to move freely yet. And that distinction matters, because quarantine is temporary, but only if you work with it. If isolation is making you more disciplined, more honest, more internally anchored, it's doing its job. If it's making you stagnant, resentful, or addicted to the idea that you're misunderstood, something has gone wrong. And this is where the illusion of abandonment collapses. You weren't removed to be punished, but you also weren't removed to be admired from a distance. You were removed to reduce interference, to limit damage while something unstable reorganizes itself. The danger isn't being alone. The danger is mistaking isolation for validation instead of recognizing it as a demand. Because quarantine doesn't last forever. Eventually, it ends. And what you built while no one was watching determines whether you re-enter the world strengthened or carrying a story that was never meant to replace real growth. Energetic quarantine is only the outer layer. What follows is more invasive and far more misunderstood. This is where psychological stripping begins. Most people think transformation is about adding something new knowledge, new power, a higher identity. But real transformation works in the opposite direction. It subtracts. Psychological stripping is the systematic removal of everything your identity once depended on to feel real. Not gently, not symbolically, and not all at once, but relentlessly. This is where people panic, because the losses feel personal. You might lose the role that once defined you, a career that gave you structure, a relationship that anchored your sense of worth, a reputation that made you feel visible, even a belief system that once kept you stable. And the instinctive reaction is to assume you've failed. But here's the responsibility checkpoint most narratives avoid. Loss alone does not equal growth. Stripping only becomes preparation if something stronger replaces what was taken, not externally, but internally. The reason psychological stripping hurts so much is because the ego does not surrender voluntarily. It survives by attachment. It attaches to roles, to recognition, to being needed, to being admired, to being right. When those attachments are removed, the ego interprets it as annihilation. But what's actually being targeted isn't your core, it's the scaffolding. And scaffolding is temporary by design. This is where many people misinterpret the process. They assume that because things are being taken away, they are being punished. Or worse, that endurance itself is proof they're on the right path. That's dangerous. Because psychological stripping does not automatically make you stronger. It makes you exposed. Exposure can build integrity, or it can build defenses. Integrity looks like this. You stop defining yourself through what you've lost. You become more precise about what you allow into your life. You start making decisions based on internal alignment rather than external survival. Defensiveness looks very different. You harden. You romanticize suffering. You turn loss into a badge instead of a lesson. That's not stripping. That's substitution. Real psychological stripping leaves you with less story, not more. Less explanation. Less justification. Less need to be seen a certain way. It doesn't inflate your sense of importance. It removes your hiding places. Think of it like refining metal. Heat doesn't add value, it reveals structure. What survives the heat was always there. What burns away was never meant to carry weight. And this is where comfort becomes the enemy. If the process were comfortable, the ego would adapt without changing. It would learn new language, adopt new beliefs, and continue operating the same way underneath. Stripping interrupts that. It forces you to confront who you are when no one is validating you, relying on you, or watching you struggle. And here's the part that requires honesty. If the stripping phase is making you more grounded, more responsible, and more capable of standing alone without resentment, it's doing its job. If it's making you bitter, withdrawn, or addicted to the idea that you're meant for more without doing more, it has stalled. Because psychological stripping isn't about suffering longer. It's about reducing dependency. Dependency on approval. Dependency on roles. Dependency on external identity. When those supports are removed, one of two things happens. You either collapse inward or you consolidate. Consolidation is quiet, unimpressive, invisible from the outside. But it's where real strength forms. Not the kind that needs an audience. Not the kind that survives by comparison. The kind that doesn't disappear when everything familiar is gone. That's why this phase feels ruthless. Not because it's cruel, but because it's efficient. And efficiency doesn't care how meaningful the story sounds. It only responds to what you're actually building in the absence of everything you used to lean on. Psychological stripping isn't proof that you're chosen. It's proof that something unessential is being removed. What matters isn't what was taken. It's what's left standing when nothing else is holding you up. Most people spend their lives chasing comfort, stability, predictability, relief from pressure. And on the surface, that seems reasonable. Comfort feels like safety, like proof that things are finally working. But comfort has a hidden cost, one that only becomes visible when something greater is required of you. Comfort doesn't prepare you. It preserves you exactly as you are. And preservation is useful only when what you're preserving is already sufficient. For anyone undergoing real transformation, comfort becomes an obstacle. Not because comfort is evil, but because it anesthetizes friction. Friction is where feedback lives. It's where weaknesses are exposed. It's where habits are either refined or abandoned. Without friction, nothing is challenged. Without challenge, nothing consolidates. This is why periods of enforced discomfort often accompany psychological stripping. Not as punishment, not as proof of virtue, but as training. Training requires resistance. A muscle doesn't grow because it's treated gently. It grows because it's placed under controlled strain, then allowed to recover stronger. The problem is that many people confuse training with endurance. They assume that if something hurts, it must be productive. That's a mistake. Discomfort that sharpens you is training. Discomfort that depletes you is neglect. Training increases capacity. Neglect erodes it. And the difference isn't how intense the experience feels, it's what it produces over time. Training leads to greater clarity, stability, and self-regulation. Neglect leads to exhaustion, resentment, and collapse. This distinction matters because comfort isn't the only enemy here. Misinterpreted discomfort is just as dangerous. Some people reject comfort so completely that they begin to equate suffering with growth. They stop resting. They stop integrating. They stop allowing anything supportive into their lives. That isn't strength. It's another form of avoidance. Real preparation isn't about staying uncomfortable forever. It's about becoming capable enough that comfort no longer weakens you. Think of the difference between a wild animal and a captive one. A captive animal is fed regularly, sheltered constantly, and protected from challenge. Over time, it loses its instincts, its reflexes dull, its resilience fades. A wild animal, on the other hand, doesn't live in constant agony, but it does live in constant engagement. Its environment demands attention, adaptation, responsiveness. That engagement keeps it sharp. Comfort removes the need to engage. And when engagement disappears, growth stalls. This is why comfort becomes the enemy during preparation phases. Not because you don't deserve ease, but because ease too early creates fragility. If your current discomfort is forcing you to develop discipline, self-honesty, and internal structure, it's serving a purpose. If it's simply draining you while producing no increase in capacity, it needs to be questioned, not glorified. The goal isn't to suffer. The goal is to become capable. And capability is built where comfort can't reach you yet, but responsibility still can. Comfort isn't the enemy forever. It just can't be the foundation. Not until you've built something inside yourself that doesn't collapse the moment the pressure returns. At this point, a necessary question emerges. How do you tell the difference between genuine preparation and a slow collapse disguised as meaning? Because not every withdrawal is intentional. Not every quiet phase is purposeful. And not every ending is part of a larger design. Hidden preparation leaves traces, but they aren't mystical signs. They're functional changes. The first sign is increased sensitivity, not in a dramatic way, but in a discerning one. You become less tolerant of noise, emotional, social, or psychological. Crowded environments drain you faster. Superficial conversations feel exhausting. Certain foods, habits, or digital inputs suddenly feel disruptive rather than neutral. This isn't about superiority. It's about signal-to-noise ratio. Your system is recalibrating, and anything that fragments your attention becomes noticeable. The second sign is a pull inward that produces structure, not stagnation. You spend more time alone, but not drifting. You read, reflect, write, train, or study. Your inner world becomes more organized, not more chaotic. Preparation doesn't isolate you into numbness. It consolidates you into coherence. If solitude leads to clarity and self-direction, it's working. If it leads to endless rumination without action, something has stalled. The third sign is cleaner endings. When certain relationships, roles, or identities fall away, the pain is real, but underneath it, there is relief. Not joy, not excitement. Relief. A quiet recognition that something unsustainable has finally stopped. Preparation removes what you can no longer carry, not because it was evil, but because it no longer fits the structure you're forming. The fourth sign is a decrease in external urgency. You stop feeling the need to explain yourself. You stop chasing validation. You stop reacting to every misunderstanding. Not because you're detached, but because your center of gravity has moved inward. This is where many people get confused. They assume that no longer needing approval means they're above others. That's not preparation. That's inflation. Real preparation produces humility, not distance. Stability, not contempt. The final sign is subtle but decisive. Your sense of responsibility increases. Not responsibility for fixing others. Responsibility for your own clarity, boundaries, and actions. You stop waiting for permission to become disciplined. You stop blaming circumstances for a lack of follow-through. You begin asking better questions about your own behavior. This is the dividing line. Hidden preparation doesn't make you feel chosen. It makes you feel accountable. If what you're going through is making you more capable of standing on your own without resentment, you're likely in a preparation phase. If it's making you passive, entitled, or dependent on the story itself, it's time to reassess. Preparation isn't about being hidden forever. It's about becoming solid enough that when visibility returns, you don't fracture under it. At some point, the question stops being why this is happening and becomes what you're going to do with it. Isolation, stripping, discomfort, preparation. None of these are explanations you can live inside forever. They're conditions, temporary ones. And the danger isn't that you misunderstand them at first. The danger is that you get comfortable inside the interpretation. Because preparation is not a destination. It's a phase, and phases are meant to be outgrown. If your solitude has taught you discipline, clarity, and restraint, it has served its purpose. If it has made you more self-aware, more honest about your patterns, and less dependent on external validation, something solid has been built. But if the story itself has become the shelter, if the idea of being protected has replaced the work of becoming capable, then what started as preparation has quietly turned into avoidance. That's not a moral failure, it's a human one. Meaning is comforting, especially when life feels stripped down and uncertain. But meaning without responsibility doesn't strengthen you, it stalls you. Real preparation doesn't make you feel chosen. It makes you feel ready, or at least more ready than before. Ready to engage without losing yourself. Ready to carry pressure without collapsing. Ready to step back into complexity without needing to dominate it or disappear from it. And that's the part most narratives leave out. Eventually, the quarantine ends. The stripping stops. The pressure shifts. And when it does, the question isn't whether you were protected. The question is whether you use that protection to build something real, or just to survive long enough to tell a convincing story. This channel isn't here to give you a role to hide inside. It's here to help you recognize when a phase is asking more of you than endurance. So don't rush to label what you're going through, and don't romanticize it either. Instead, ask yourself something quieter and far more demanding. Is this making me more capable, more grounded, more responsible for how I show up when no one is watching? If the answer is yes, keep going. If the answer is unclear, slow down and look honestly. And if you're willing to do that, not declare who you are, not claim what you're destined for, but actually engage with the work this phase is asking of you, then you're not wasting this time. If this video resonated, don't affirm it, don't repeat it. Instead, leave a comment that says, "I'm willing to do the work." Because preparation doesn't respond to belief, it responds to action. And that's where the real work begins.